The Golden State Killer. In the quiet suburbs of California, a dark chapter in American criminal history unfolded over 12 years, a case that would take 4 decades to solve, demonstrating that time and technology could finally bring justice to light. Before we begin, this video contains discussions of serious crimes and sensitive content. While presented respectfully, viewer discretion is advised. The story begins in the mid-1970s. California was experiencing unprecedented growth. New suburbs sprouted across the state, their similar layouts and designs creating both community and vulnerability. It was an era before home security systems, before DNA testing, before the interconnected world we know today. At first, the crimes seemed disconnected. In Visalia, a series of break-ins disturbed the peace of this agricultural community. The perpetrators showed unusual patterns, studying homes meticulously, moving through them with inexplicable familiarity, and taking items of personal rather than monetary value. Local police knew they weren't dealing with ordinary burglaries. As the crimes moved north to Sacramento County, the pattern evolved into something more sinister. Upper middle-class neighborhoods became targets. The perpetrator demonstrated extensive knowledge of police procedures, even appearing to monitor law enforcement frequencies. He would spend hours in victims' homes before and during attacks, learning their routines, becoming familiar with escape routes. Detective Paul Holes, who would later become instrumental in solving the case, noted something crucial. These weren't crimes of opportunity. Each attack showed methodical planning, suggesting a perpetrator with military or law enforcement training. The investigation faced numerous challenges. Multiple jurisdictions were involved, each with pieces of a puzzle they couldn't yet see was connected. Different names emerged for what they later learned was the same perpetrator: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker. Despite thousands of tips, hundreds of suspects, and unprecedented cooperation between law enforcement agencies, the trail went cold. But the case was never forgotten. Dedicated investigators kept returning to the evidence, waiting for technology to catch up with their determination. That breakthrough came in 2018. Investigators, led by Paul Holes and his team, took an innovative approach. They had preserved DNA evidence. Now they needed to find its owner. Using GETmatch, a public genealogy website, they uploaded the DNA profile. This wasn't a direct match search. Instead, they were looking for distant relatives who shared enough DNA to build family trees. The search led them through countless branches of family histories, narrowing down possibilities until one name emerged: Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had worked in areas connected to the crimes. On April 24, 2018, after careful surveillance and DNA confirmation from discarded items, law enforcement moved in. D'Angelo was arrested without incident. The man who had terrorized California communities for years was finally in custody. In 2020, in a makeshift courtroom necessitated by the COVID-19 pandemic, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder, 13 counts of kidnapping, and multiple other crimes. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The significance of this case extends far beyond its resolution. It validated genetic genealogy as a powerful investigative tool, now used to solve other cold cases. It demonstrated the crucial importance of preserving evidence, even when technology hasn't caught up to its potential. Perhaps most importantly, it proved that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be served. For every cold case that remains unsolved, the Golden State Killer investigation offers hope. It stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who never give up, and to the advances in science that make the impossible possible. To the survivors and families affected by these crimes, this resolution cannot undo the past, but It demonstrates that time does not protect the guilty when justice is pursued with determination and innovation. For more information about this case and resources for those affected by violent crime, please see the links in our description below. All information presented comes from public records and court documents.
The Power Play, Chief Jefferson's Unforgettable Test. It was just another Tuesday morning when Lisa Jefferson, the newly appointed chief of police for Rivertown, drove down the familiar stretch of Interstate 47. The road was quiet, just as she liked it. She often found peace in these early drives, when the world had yet to wake up fully. The morning air, crisp and cool, filtered through the open windows of her sleek black sedan, carrying the scent of autumn. The golden leaves swirled gently around the tires as she cruised steadily, lost in her thoughts. Lisa had always enjoyed these moments alone, before the storm of the day's duties began. As the new chief of police, there were so many things on her mind. She had only recently assumed the role, but she had earned it after more than a decade of dedicated service. The climb to the top hadn't been easy, and Lisa had paid her dues. She had worked tirelessly to prove herself, always staying humble, never flaunting her position. She knew the weight of her responsibilities, and as much as she relished the success, she couldn't afford to get too comfortable. Rivertown, a small city nestled in a quiet part of the state, wasn't known for much. But as Lisa took on her new role, she knew that under her leadership, the police department could become something exceptional. She had big plans that would take time and commitment. But first, she needed to learn to navigate this new world she had stepped into, balancing the politics of her position with the duty of ensuring safety in the community. The morning was uneventful, and for a moment, Lisa allowed herself to simply enjoy the quiet. Her mind wandered through various scenarios: how to bring in new initiatives for the department, how to improve relations between the police force and the community, how to establish herself as both a leader and a figure of authority. But as Lisa's mind worked through these thoughts, she saw the first sign of disruption. As she neared exit 13, she saw the familiar flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. At first, it barely registered. Surely it wasn't meant for her. She wasn't speeding. Her car was registered, her insurance up to date. There was nothing about her driving that should have attracted attention. But the sirens persisted, louder now, cutting through the quiet of the morning. It wasn't just a passing patrol car. It was pulling up behind her. She felt a flicker of confusion and then uneasiness. The cruiser drew closer. Lisa signaled to the side of the road and slowed, bringing her car to a gentle stop. She glanced at the dashboard once more, ensuring everything was in order. Her speed was within the limit, and there was nothing to indicate why she had been stopped. The patrol car came to a halt behind her. She waited for a moment, but nothing happened. She watched through the rearview mirror as the officers inside the car began to move. One officer, tall and wearing dark sunglasses, stepped out first, followed by his partner, a shorter man with a rough exterior. They didn't seem hurried, but their movements were purposeful. Lisa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She watched as the taller officer approached her window, his flashlight tapping against the side of her sedan. His uniform was crisp, and there was an air of cold professionalism about him. Something about the way they moved made Lisa uneasy. They weren't acting like typical officers making a routine stop. There was an underlying tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp and detached. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Good morning, officers. Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the unease that had begun to settle in. The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he leaned in a little closer, his face unreadable. "License and registration," he repeated, this time more forcefully. Lisa hesitated, her heart beginning to race. There was no reason for this. Her mind raced through possibilities, but none of them made sense. Why was she being stopped? Why the aggression? Reluctantly, she reached for her wallet and handed over her license and registration. She tried to remain calm, but inside, her mind was working in overdrive. The second officer, Officer Grady, stood a few feet away on the passenger side of the car. His eyes never left Lisa. There was something in the way he watched her smithing that felt like scrutiny, suspicion. She kept her gaze focused ahead, refusing to let herself show how unsettled she was. Officer James, the first officer, looked at her license without saying a word. He didn't seem to care about her credentials. His eyes flickered back to Lisa, cold and unyielding. He didn't appear impressed. "You work around here?" he asked, his voice edged with something that felt almost accusatory. Lisa maintained her composure. "Yes, I do," she answered flatly, choosing her words carefully. She wasn't about to make this worse by saying too much. She knew better than to escalate things unnecessarily. But the way they were treating Harriet wasn't right. "Well, see about that," James muttered under his breath. He turned away from her, exchanging a brief look with his partner. Grady gave a small nod, and without warning, the two began whispering between themselves. Their heads bent low as though discussing something important. Minutes passed. Lisa sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She watched the officers as they murmured to each other, their eyes flicking back to her occasionally. The tension was palpable now, thick in the air. Lisa's mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of what was happening. They hadn't told her why she'd been stopped, and they didn't seem interested in explaining. Her patience, usually steady, began to wear thin. She glanced at the rearview mirror once more. Her calm morning was quickly unraveling, and she was starting to feel the weight of the situation. Finally, Officer James returned to her window. His face was hard, his lips drawn in a thin line. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Lisa blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. What was happening? Why was she being asked to step out of the car? "Step out of the vehicle," James repeated, this time with more force. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She tried to remain composed. "Can you at least tell me why I'm being asked to get out?" she pressed, still keeping her tone measured, though she could feel the tension rising. "Step out, now," Officer Grady barked from the passenger side. He was growing impatient, his voice now laced with an edge that was hard to ignore. Lisa's pulse quickened. There was no arguing. She had no choice but to comply. She opened the door, stepping out of the car slowly. She was acutely aware of the officers moving closer to her, their hands hovering near their holsters. It was as though they expected trouble, though there was nothing to indicate that anything was amiss. Lisa stood tall, trying to project calmness, but inside, her instincts were on high alert. Something was wrong, and she could feel it deep in her bones. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of authority. She was the chief of police. She should not be in this situation. Officer James smirked. "We got reports about a vehicle matching this description. Might be involved in suspicious activity," he said, his words carrying an insinuation that sent a chill down Lisa's spine. "Suspicious activity?" Lisa repeated, her tone incredulous. "What kind of illegal activity?" Officer Grady stepped forward. His arms were crossed, but there was something defensive in his posture. "Well, be the ones asking the questions," he replied, his voice sharp. Lisa's mind reeled. She wasn't a stranger to confrontationously being a black woman in a position of authority in America, but this felt different. It felt personal. They hadn't even checked her license. They hadn't followed procedure. They'd just seen here a black woman in a car and made assumptions. As the officers searched her car, their expressions shifted to something like smug satisfaction, as if they were enjoying the process. Lisa kept her face neutral, but inside, she was boiling. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't about protocol. This was about power, and they were playing a dangerous game. After a few minutes, Officer Grady stepped back, a look of disappointment on his face. "Nothing in here," he muttered, almost as if he had hoped for something more. But then the words she had been waiting for came. "We're going to need you to come with us for questioning," Officer James announced, his voice authoritative, as though he had all the power in this situation. Lisa smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that came from understanding something they didn't. She knew exactly what was about to happen. Before she could respond, a familiar black SUV pulled up behind the cruiser. The engine rumbled as it came to a stop, and out stepped a tall figure, Deputy Chief Martin, her superior, the man who had hired her for this role. Lisa's heart calmed in an instant. This was the moment. Is everything okay here? Deputy Chief Martin's voice rang out with an authority that instantly made both officers stiffen. James and Grady froze, their eyes widening in recognition. It didn't take them long to realize the woman they had just pulled over wasn't just any civilian. She wasn't just some woman they could intimidate. She was Lisa Jefferson of Police, their boss. The realization hit like a thunderclap, and Lisa could see their faces drain of color. They were trapped now. They had no way to talk their way out of this. Deputy Chief Martin walked up to them, his gaze shifting between Lisa and the two officers. His voice was stern. What exactly is going on here? He demanded. James opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He was stumbling now, trying to find the right explanation. We pulled her over because her car matched a description we were given, he stammered, his voice shaky. Description? For what? Martin's voice was cold, his eyes narrowing. He turned his gaze to Lisa, who was now standing silently, her arms crossed. Lisa didn't speak immediately. She didn't need to, her presence was enough. I want to know what happened, Martin said, his voice low, but carrying weight. He wasn't going to let them off easy. And then Lisa spoke, her voice sharp as a blade. Did you run my license, Officer James? James looked up, startled. Well, we were in the middle of. That's a no, Lisa interrupted, her voice firm. You didn't even check who I was before you pulled me over. You saw a black woman in a car, and you made an assumption. The tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. It was quiet now, no more talking between the officers. No more excuses. It was time to make a choice. Lisa took a deep breath and turned to Deputy Chief Martin. I'm not going to fire them. Not yet, but I want them suspended, effective immediately. There needs to be an internal investigation. They've broken protocol, and they've abused their power. This cannot stand. Martin nodded. Consider it done. As the officers stood there, their heads bowed, Lisa took one last look at them. If you're going to wear that badge, you better earn it every single day, she said, her voice ringing with the finality of the statement.